Someone rewrote you. Not dramatically, there was no confrontation, no public declaration, no moment where you were invited to defend yourself before the verdict was delivered. It happened quietly, in conversations you were not part of, in the retelling of events that were real but rendered unrecognizable by the particular angle chosen to present them, and the person who did it was not necessarily malicious in the way that word usually implies. They were simply cornered by their own choices, their own inconsistencies, their own need to remain sympathetic in the eyes of people whose opinions they could not afford to lose. A villain in the story solves that problem cleanly. It absorbs the contradiction, explains the behavior, and leaves the storyteller intact. You were not chosen for that role because of your flaws. You were chosen because your absence from the room made you available for it. There is a specific kind of pain that arrives not from what someone did to you, but from who they decided you were after it ended. The recast, the revision, the version of you that circulates in rooms you no longer enter, told by a voice you once trusted, believed by people who never thought to question it. And what makes this particular wound so difficult to process is not the lie itself, it is the precision of it. The villain in someone else's story is never constructed randomly. They are selected, carefully, unconsciously, necessarily, because the alternative, a story without a villain, is a story that turns its gaze inward. And that is the one story most people will spend their entire lives avoiding. The human mind cannot tolerate narrative incoherence. This is not a weakness. It is a feature of how consciousness protects itself. When a person's behavior cannot be reconciled with the image they hold of themselves, something must shift. Either the self-image adjusts, which is painful and slow, and demands a kind of honesty that not everyone is capable of sustaining, or the story adjusts. Blame migrates. It finds the most available surface, which is almost always the person no longer present to complicate the account. The absent one cannot offer context, cannot add texture, cannot remind anyone of the moments that don't fit the narrative. And so they become useful, not because they were guilty, because they were gone. What the person casting the villain rarely understands, and perhaps never will, is how completely the story they're telling reveals them. The specific accusations, the particular distortions, the details chosen for emphasis, and the ones quietly omitted, none of this is arbitrary. Each element reflects an internal pressure point. Each exaggeration marks something the storyteller cannot look at directly. The villain is always constructed in the shape of the storyteller's unresolved guilt, which means that anyone willing to read carefully enough will find, embedded in the accusation, a confession. Not a deliberate one, but a confession nonetheless. The anguish of being misrepresented to people who believed it is its own specific category of suffering. There is the impulse to correct it, to reach into that narrative and restore accuracy, to present evidence, to appeal to the logic of people who have already decided. And this impulse is understandable, but it is also the most exhausting trap available, because you cannot win an argument inside someone else's story. The terrain is entirely theirs. The rules are written to exclude your version. Every attempt to clarify is absorbed into the existing frame, recast as defensiveness, as instability, as further proof of exactly what they claimed. The story was not built to be challenged. It was built to hold. What remains once the impulse to defend has exhausted itself is something quieter and more durable. The recognition that being named the villain was never a verdict on your character. It was a verdict on what the other person required in order to remain at peace with their own. The story they told was not about you. It was for them. a structure built to make their choices feel inevitable, their behavior feel justified, their pain feel externally caused rather than internally generated. You were the necessary explanation, and necessary explanations are never chosen for their accuracy. They are chosen for their convenience. There is a strange, unsettling freedom in understanding this fully, not the freedom of vindication. No one is coming to correct the record, and waiting for that correction is its own kind of captivity. But the freedom of clarity, of knowing that the shape of someone's villain reveals the shape of their wound, of understanding that the story was never really about you, and that the most honest response to being written into someone else's fiction is simply to close the book and continue living in a world they no longer have access to. There is a particular internal architecture required to hold a private truth while a public distortion moves through the world unchallenged. It does not develop quickly. It is built slowly, under pressure, through a series of moments in which the impulse to correct, to interject, to produce evidence, to make the room understand, is consciously withheld, not because the truth is uncertain, but because the person carrying it has done the calculation, clearly and without sentiment, and understood that entering the public argument would not restore reality. It would only reduce a complex lived experience into a performance of grievance designed to win sympathy rather than recover anything true. And some truths are too precise, too layered, too personally costly to survive. The compression that public defense requires. What is rarely examined about this kind of silence is how sophisticated it actually is. To stay quiet in the face of misrepresentation is not weakness, and it is not complicity. It is the restraint of someone who has read the room accurately, who understood, perhaps before the room understood itself, that the people circulating the false version were not doing so in search of correction. They were doing so in service of a need. The narrative had a function. It organized something for them, explained something, protected something. And a person who sees this clearly also sees what follows. That no intervention, however factual, however measured, would have dislodged the story. Because the story was not about truth, it was about necessity. The tension that lives inside this silence is specific. On one side, the deeply human need to be understood, to have the record exist somewhere outside the self, to be witnessed accurately by at least one person in the room. On the other side, the slow, clarifying recognition that the people who required the false version were never under any circumstance going to be the ones to offer that witnessing. They could not. Understanding you accurately would have cost them the story they needed. And a person can spend years standing in that gap between the truth they hold and the understanding they will not receive from the only people who seem to matter in that moment. Before something in them finally recalibrates around a different center, that recalibration is quiet. It does not arrive with resolution or relief. What it arrives with is a kind of settled clarity. That what actually happened does not become less true because no one publicly confirmed it. That the version of yourself you know most clearly, the one that existed before the narrative, that persists beneath it, that required no external validation to function, is not diminished by the room's inability to see it. The truth was always yours. It remained yours through all of it, and the fact that you never made it the room's problem says something about you that the room's version never could. For as long as a person remains psychologically occupied with the narrative assigned to them by others, their energy is not free. It is tethered. Every day spent in the orbit of someone else's version of events is a day that cannot be spent building an alternative. This is not an obvious trap, because the impulse to correct a false record feels entirely reasonable. It feels like integrity. It feels like self-respect. even. But there is a distinction between defending the truth and constructing, and the person who has been assigned a damaging story often confuses the two for so long that they never arrive at the second. Defense is reactive by nature. It requires the presence of an accusation to have any shape at all. Construction requires nothing external. It begins in private. It develops through action, and it becomes over time something so fully realized that the original accusation no longer has a context in which to exist. The story doesn't get corrected, it gets replaced. The internal movement this requires is more difficult than it sounds, because it involves releasing something that feels almost righteous. The desire for vindication, specifically the desire for the people who believed the false version to eventually witness the true one, to see with their own eyes that they were wrong. There is nothing shameful in this desire. It is human, and it is understandable, and it has driven genuine achievement in more people than would admit it. But it is also a leash, because as long as the goal is their witness, their judgment remains the measure of success. The moment it is released, genuinely released, not suppressed, the entire orientation of the work changes. What was being built as proof becomes something built for its own sake. And that shift, quiet as it is, produces a different quality of outcome. Work done to be seen carries the anxiety of the audience inside it. Work done because the builder has become too absorbed in the manuscript to care about outside observers carries something else entirely. A kind of density, a completeness that becomes its own form of evidence without ever needing to present itself as such. The philosophical axis here is not complicated, but it is easy to miss in practice. The person who controls their own narrative does not need to win arguments. They do not need to be believed by the people who chose not to believe them. They do not need their detractors to arrive, eventually, at a more accurate version of events. What they need, and what becomes available the moment the defensive posture is released, is the freedom to build something so fully their own that the original argument becomes geographically irrelevant. Not disproven, not avenged, simply located in a landscape that no longer includes them. Authorship, in this sense, is not a creative act. It is a sovereign one. The person who has become the author of their own life does not look back at the chapters written by others with anger or grief. They look back, if at all, with the mild recognition that those chapters belong to a time when someone else held the pen. That time has passed. The writing continues, and it is entirely, and at last, their own. There is something worth examining in the specific structure of this kind of arc, not as narrative comfort, not as the universe correcting itself, but as a behavioral pattern that operates with quiet, almost mechanical consistency. When a false identity is assigned to a person from the outside, it carries a fundamental structural flaw. It has no interior life. It can travel. It can be repeated in rooms the person never entered, believed by people who never looked closely enough to question it. But it cannot survive prolonged contact with the actual human being it was constructed to describe. Not because truth is loud or vindicating, but because a person who continues to build, to act with integrity, to make choices that reflect who they actually are, generates over time a body of evidence that no external narrative can permanently contradict. The false version requires constant maintenance. The real one simply continues to exist. What makes this arc feel inevitable, rather than fortunate, is precisely that it does not depend on fairness. It does not require the people who believed the false version to recant, or for the original storyteller to be publicly exposed, or for any external correction to occur at all. It depends only on one thing, that the person who was misrepresented does not internalize the misrepresentation. Identity imposed from the outside has no root system. It can occupy space temporarily, create doubt, generate pain, destabilize a sense of self during the period when the wound is still fresh. But a person who knows, with the particular quiet certainty that comes not from confidence but from self-knowledge, that what was said about them was functionally necessary rather than factually true, that person cannot be permanently housed in a role they never inhabited. They outgrow the story, not by escaping it, but by building something the story was too small to contain. The internal complexity that arrives at the end of this arc is rarely discussed because it does not fit neatly into either vindication or forgiveness. It is something more textured than both. There is a specific, uncomfortable recognition that comes when a person reaches a place of genuine stability and looks back at the pressure that preceded it and notices with something between gratitude and unease that the adversity contributed, that the misrepresentation, the forced isolation, the experience of being reduced to a function in someone else's narrative, created conditions that demanded a level of self-reliance, self-definition, and interior construction that easier circumstances would never have required. The people who cast you as the villain did not intend to give you anything, but in requiring you to refuse that role and forcing you to know yourself clearly enough to reject an identity that did not belong to you, Hay inadvertently accelerated something that was always latent. That is not debt. It is not forgiveness either. It is simply an accurate accounting of how pressure, when not internalized as identity, becomes architecture. The villain in someone else's story and the hero in your own are not different people, separated by perspective. They are the same person observed at different distances across different measures of time. Up close, inside the crisis of being misrepresented, the role feels definitive. From the distance that only continued living provides, it reveals itself as a temporary assignment that was never going to hold, not because you fought it, but because you kept building regardless.